Good evening. My name is Bill Henry. I am the councilman from the 4th District and chair of the Housing and Community Development Committee for the Baltimore City Council. I am joined this evening by my colleagues to my left, Councilman William Pete Welch of the 9th District, member of the committee, Councilman Nick Mosby of the 7th District, member of the committee, and Councilwoman Mary Pat Clark of the 14th District, also a member of the committee. Staff to the committee to my right, Mr. Richard Crumrick, just noted that we have managed quorum without even having our vice chair, because our vice chair was taken from us when he stepped down to run the Baltimore Development Corporation, and so our committee is now missing one person, and yet we still managed to have quorum this evening, so I'm very happy for my colleagues here. Further to the right, we have Ms. Kara Kunst of the President's office, as well as Mr. Paul. Well, you know, I know it is actually Plymouth, but I really like to upgrade him to Cadillac for these meetings. Also of the President's office, and then to my far right, Ms. Maggie Porter, legislative aide to the chair. And then in the chambers, we are joined by Ms. Angela Gibson, representing the mayor's office. We have a little bit of work to handle tonight in terms of the difference between this meeting as originally advertised and this meeting as it's going to run. The first thing I want to note is that the work session on City Council 13-0293, unsafe vacant structures, is going to be moved to the end of the agenda so that we can have a more substantive discussion on some proposed amendments to that bill. The hearing on City Council Bill 14-0170R, a resolution requesting state action clarifying that vacant nonprofit-owned property is not tax exempt, is being postponed to a date to be announced later. And then finally, the resolution that we were supposed to hear at 5:05 p.m. tonight, City Council 14-0160R, resolution request for state action, state-run home insurer of last resort. This resolution was offered in response to concerns that had been brought to us about an increasing practice of insurance companies refusing to cover people whose homes are next to vacant houses. And what we learned shortly before time for this hearing is that there is an entity that is specifically supposed to be dealing with situations like that, but due to what may be a marketing problem, what may be a communications problem, or what may be a problem in the wording of the law that created them, almost nobody seems to know that they exist, and they were not able to be here with us tonight. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold that conversation also off into a future time so that we don't wind up in the position of asking the General Assembly to recreate something that they've already created. That takes us to the resolution that we intended to hear at 5:10 p.m., City Council Resolution 14-0175, request for state legislation, prompt recordation of bank foreclosure deeds. And this bill for the purpose of requesting, this resolution for the purpose of requesting the Honorable Chair and members of the Baltimore City Senate and House delegation to the General Assembly to introduce legislation to require that banks promptly record the deeds to properties purchased at foreclosure auctions. We have a couple people signed in to talk about this one, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to start with Mr. Dan Ellis. Dan Ellis, am I pronouncing that right? Dan Ellis?
Yeah.
Of NHS.
Thanks, Councilman. So a couple thoughts on this bill. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity and invitation to come and testify on it. I am Dan Ellis. I'm the Executive Director of Neighborhood Housing Services of Baltimore. In that capacity, I also co-chair a subcommittee of the Baltimore Homeownership Preservation Coalition that's looking into the tax sale questions here in Baltimore City. One of the things that, as we saw this bill, that we wanted to make sure that it was included in your scope of thinking is tax sales, which is a form of foreclosure. It's not a form of bank foreclosure, but it's a form of foreclosure that occurs. One of the things that we have found is happening frequently with foreclosures, or with tax sale foreclosures in the city, is that there are groups that are buying large volumes or large numbers of tax sale properties all at once. They pursue foreclosure, they get to the point of a deed, and then they hold the deed and don't record it. And until there's an actual buyer in place for the property, they hold on to the deed without recording it, which leaves maintenance of the property as deferred. Either the city has to come in and do the maintenance and put a municipal lien on it, or more likely, in many neighborhoods, maintenance simply doesn't happen, or neighbors bear the costs of taking care of the property. And so our encouragement is that those property deeds be required to be recorded within 60 days, as is recommended with this legislation with the bank foreclosures. So our request is that if you're going to make a recommendation, that you include the tax sale foreclosures in with the bank foreclosures if you move forward with this resolution. So thank you, Councilman Henry, for the invitation to speak.
Thank you. Councilwoman Clark.
Hi, Mr. Ellis.
Good to see you, Councilwoman.
We used to hang out in Penn Lucy in the day, and Mr. Ellis is a wonderful advocate. Okay, I have a question because what you just said caught my attention. And here's what it is. Once upon a time, not too long ago, like in a week, there's a tax sale going on in a neighborhood that I represent. In this case, the family in the house that's being tax sale foreclosed is, let's just say, going away parties are being prepared. And so I happen to be speaking to the certificate holder who has got a judgment. This is the tax sale holder, has a judgment from the court that says he owns this property. And because he now does, he has arranged an auction for a certain date.
Right.
Okay. So I said, well, have you seen the place? Have it, yeah. I said, well, have you thought about eviction? And he said, I don't have the deed, so I cannot evict.
Right.
So I said, why do you not have the deed? You have a judgment that says you own it, you're selling it, but you don't have a deed. And the reason was that to get the deed from the city, he, the winning bidder of the certificate, has to pay up his bid.
Right.
So he has to pay the city the full amount that of his winning bid for him to get, I guess the city has it, the deed.
That's right.
So that's a problem because this particular person, for example, needs to have a certain amount of money bid in order to be able to do that. And if he doesn't get that bid, this could be any place in the city.
That's right.
But let's
He might walk away.
That's right.
So then nobody records the deed ever. So
It sits in a file cabinet in the finance department.
is that where it is?
There's a file cabinet full of deeds in the finance department. According to the finance department, there is.
Well, then that's who we should be talking to.
And what they told us in a meeting was that most deeds don't get picked up, that people wait until they have a buyer with adequate resources to pay all of the back liens, Because what they actually have to pay to pick up the deed is all of the taxes and liens that have accrued on the property since the tax sale, because they pay the amount to buy the certificate at the tax sale, but taxes still are due subsequent to that. Municipal liens for whatever happens on the property is due after that. So all of those deeds or liens accumulate. And in order to get that deed from the finance department, you have to pay all the back bills to the city. But what happens is in the event that they don't get a bid that's large enough at this auction next week or the week after,
Or next month.
whenever the auction is that property is now in limbo. So the property in your neighborhood could effectively sit in property ownership limbo, because if someone wanted to come along and then buy the property, there is still this outstanding judgment, there's still this outstanding deed that exists for the property. So you can't go to that property owner who they're having going away parties for. If this doesn't sell and they stay in their house, you can't go to them and just get a clean title because they want to buy the property from you.
You mean the people that have had the, right, they can't
Just go.
sell it.
That's right. They can't sell it without dealing with the holder of this deed. They could pay off the owner of the deed and say, we're selling the property.
You mean certificate, the owner of the
Certificate,
the
but-
tax sale certificate.
Right.
Someone owns,
They have a right to the deed. So the owner of the tax sale certificate right now has the right to redeem that deed. Once you go through,
right, but not the money,
that's right,
because it's more than just the liens
that's right,
that took it to tax sale. There's a bidding process,
that's right.
and he or she had to outbid other
Correct.
people to get that, and then that's the amount
Right.
that has to be paid.
Plus all the accumulated debt.
But that, yeah, there is an amount
Yep.
that
That's right.
encompasses all that, and then, so,
Your homeowner to redeem and be able to stay in their property gets more and more expensive
absolutely.
day.
Especially when you hit August. But, so, Mr. Chairman, the reason I drag you through this tale is because I'm not saying that we're doing the wrong thing, but we're part of this problem as much as anyone else. Right here in this city hall, we have a drawer full of deeds that are in limbo.
That's right.
Now, I know that tax sales are regulated by, foreclosures and all that are regulated very heavily by the state of Maryland, so that it's not like we can do a whole lot about the rules. But, and I'm not, it just seems to me that before we put this into the resolution, powerful instrument that it is, we should understand that we're talking to ourselves.
Yes.
Well, let me ask this, and then I'm going to go to Councilman Mosby, who also has a question. Mr. Klein, who would be the best person in the finance department to talk about this situation in terms of us having some large amount of deeds in the finance department?
I know. Mr. Chair, that would be Janice Simmons. She's the chief of the Bureau of Revenue Collections.
Okay.
Bureau of Revenue Collections runs the tax sale process.
So it's a bureau, therefore that's where the drawer is.
So,
Sorry, I
no,
couldn't.
no, no,
resist.
no, no, no.
I am a grandmother.
It's entirely possible that you're not the one that needs to be sorry. Councilman Mosby.
Real quick, sir, your name again?
I'm Dan Ellis, Neighborhood Housing Services.
Yes, Mr. Ellis. Real quick, what precludes a state or municipality from tying the process of receipt of those certificates to the recordation of the deed? Like, is there any way of having that process tied together? And if it was, are there any disadvantages to the person who won that certificate or to the municipality? Like, why the process is chopped up? Is there any way to tie them together?
The recording of the deed as it currently stands is kind of an open-ended process that you have to pay the bills, as Councilman Clark told us, and then you collect the deed and record it. By tying it to the conclusion of the certificate, what you do is you bring closure to the action. The city's able to collect the revenue and you end up not having properties in this limbo of who owns them, which is really what, as neighborhood advocates, we're interested in seeing properties not in the legal limbo of who owns them and how do we get it renovated or rehabbed so that it can be returned to productive use. And that's what our focus is. Not being a lawyer, I'll allow some lawyers to weigh in on the actual process and legal mechanisms. I don't.
What do you think the opposition argument would be based off of trying to tie the two together?
I think the challenge for people who buy tax sale certificates is now you have to put your cash out and you have to own and maintain the property. So when you own property, there's cost associated with the maintenance of it and the liability and all of the other things that go with it. Right now what's happening is with properties in limbo, many of these properties are vacant. The city ends up bearing the cost, neighbors end up bearing the cost, which doesn't always make the most sense from a neighborhood advocacy standpoint. It would require those who are moving to take ownership of the property to complete the process. Which would be what we would advocate.
Councilman Clark.
So basically, right now, in the case of my house, who is responsible for the condition of the exterior of that house and yard?
This owner would still be considered the owner of the property.
Because of the deed issue?
If the deed has not been recorded, they still own the property. Until a deed is recorded, they are the owner of record of the property. The owner of record of property is typically the one who is responsible for the maintenance of the property. So even if they move out because of the pending sale, they're still responsible for it from a legal sense. If it doesn't sell, they could conceivably stay in the house.
Oh, absolutely.
But let me throw this in as a question for, I'm thinking maybe the law department, but if somebody else wanted to grab it, I would understand. If the owner of record has already left the house because they don't think they own it anymore for all intents and purposes, and the house becomes run down and blighted, there is no punishment that we can impose upon the owner of record other than taking away the house they already think they don't own. Is that true? I mean, what else can we do to somebody in that situation?
Put them in the next tax sale. That's what happens.
To try to force them to fix up a house that they've already effectively vacated. Okay, it appears that Mr. Hessler has lost the coin toss.
Yes. Jason Hessler, Baltimore City Department of Housing, Community Development, and Code Enforcement. The straight out answer is that if a property is in violation of the Baltimore City Building, Fire related codes, property maintenance code, et cetera, the code does, any violations of that code are both civil penalties and criminal penalties. So the person is, if found guilty in violation of the code, is a criminal misdemeanor, could face a $500 fine per charge, not per violation, but per charge. So it'd be incumbent upon us to charge that individual for individual dates of not complying with the code.
But if they don't pay that fine, then what happens?
Then they, if found guilty and ordered to pay a fine, and then they fail to pay that fine, they would be in violation of their probation and could face jail time for.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right. Okay, but it seems like there would be better things for us to be doing
Yes.
than putting the people who've been kicked out of their house in jail for not paying to fix up the house that they've already technically lost.
Correct.
Yeah.
Better to spend the resources and time to get the property in a state where it can be fixed up by somebody.
Okay, Councilman Mosby.
Well, Chair, that's the motivation of this push to try to tie the certificate piece, with the hard line tie to the recording of the deed piece, right?
So now that we've established why we're asking for this, I think that it might be appropriate for Mr. Ellis to take his seat and for us to move on to additional testimony, because I believe we may have testimony coming from the public as to why we should not move forward in this fashion. And for that testimony, I will call upon Mr. Bob Enton, who will identify for himself who he is here representing.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Robert Enton, I'm an attorney here in Baltimore, Gordon Feinblatt, right down the street. And I've represented the Maryland Bankers Association for 30 years and appeared in front of the council and met with many of you on banking issues in Baltimore City. Mostly, you have our written testimony, and I'd urge you, when you get a chance, I gave it to staff before the hearing, to please take a look at it.
Okay.
It's somewhat detailed. The issue of foreclosed properties, as you can well imagine, has probably been one of the most active issues that I've seen in my 30 years of being in Annapolis and representing the banking industry. We've not had a single year where we haven't had a plethora of bills to deal with this issue. And specifically in 2012, to deal with the issue of recordation of deeds of trust and making sure that local governments, neighborhood groups, and affected property owners know when a property is vacant, that they can find out whether or not that property has been through a foreclosure, and if so, who is now responsible for the property. So in 2012, and I see representatives of the Mayor's Government Relations Officer here, the City Solicitor's Office, there was a gubernatorial task force to look at foreclosure issues, the second one of these task forces in 2011. We worked with all the stakeholders, and particularly stakeholders from Baltimore City, to craft a bill which is described in your handout. It was House Bill 1373. It was a departmental bill from the Department of Labor, Licensing, and Regulation. What we did was we created, and the banks paid for the creation of it, a statewide registry where within, I forget exactly how many days after every foreclosure, within 30 days after a foreclosure sale, the party who purchased the property at the sale had to register that property with the state and identify who was going to be responsible for that property, regardless of whether the property had been deeded or not. Now, that was very specific. We have to pay a fee for the registration, the lender does, and not only can the information be provided to local government is permitted to provide that information to community associations, neighborhood associations, and anyone living in that block who contacts, let's say, the city and says, we got a house at 1323 Moser Street. It's vacant. There was weeds all over the place. There are broken windows. There are people in and out of it late at night. Can you tell me, I live, 2 houses up. Can you tell me about this property? And they say, well, we can check the statewide registry. And the city can check the statewide registry and go back to the neighbor. The city can contact the person who bought the property in its sale, whether it's the bank or you or me, as can the neighbors. And I think that was the primary focus of the legislation, was to make sure that local governments and people affected by the condition of the property could find out who had bid the property in its sale. Who had purchased it at sale, and who was the owner in the court records once the sale has been ratified. I can tell you on behalf of the lenders that I represent, we don't have somebody out there watching the property 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I know. Well, we don't. We could never do that. On the other hand, it's our collateral. We do have an interest in maintaining it. And I think if we're notified, we're going to send somebody out there and try to secure the property and maintain it. So that was a bill that we passed in 2012. Also, you have on the last page, I think, or let me see here, you have a memo dated November 5, 2012, regarding City Council Bill 12-0149. One of the things we learned when this bill was introduced, which would have mandated very heavy penalties if you didn't record a deed, I think it was within 30 days after the sale was ratified, was that according to the City of Baltimore's own records, 97.5% of all deeds arising out of a foreclosure are recorded in Baltimore City within 60 days. So you've heard about tax sale foreclosures tonight. That's not us. Our foreclosures, we don't have any interest in not recording the deed, believe me. We don't have any interest in not being identified as the one who either bid the property in its sale and now has equitable title to it. And the proof is in the pudding. We do record the deeds. Now, there are circumstances when a deed might not get recorded in a timely fashion. Suppose the borrower appeals in the foreclosure case. Suppose the IRS has a lien, and that you can't record that deed till that IRS lien has been satisfied. Suppose the city has outstanding charges that it's trying to collect. So there are reasons and circumstances where a deed might not get recorded, but at least when the bank bids the property in its sale, which we do, unfortunately, in many occasions, we have no interest whatsoever in delaying the recordation of the deed. We do it in a timely fashion. And even the foreclosure attorneys, they have a vested interest in getting that deed recorded because they're probably not going to get their bill paid. You know, they work on a flat fee basis. And they charge a flat fee for handling the foreclosure from the beginning to the end. And they're not going to get paid for handling that foreclosure until they know that that deed has been recorded. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have such a high percentage of deeds that are recorded in a fairly timely fashion. One other thing in this bill, and you can find it online, and I'd be glad to send you a copy of it, it's House Bill 73 from 2012, was that bill specifically provided that for a vacant or abandoned property, if the city, and once again, this came from the mayor's office and their government relations office, and Nick is here, he can speak to it, made sure that if the city has to step in and spend money to secure a vacant property, the amount that they spend by state statute now gets added to the tax bill. And that is going to have to be paid by anybody who's going to go ahead and purchase that property and record a deed. You're going to have to pay the taxes and those charges that the city might incur to board it up, to fix it up, to secure it, now get added to the tax bill. So I guess this is a long-winded way of saying to you all that I know this is a resolution that you want to send to the state, but frankly, I think that the problem that you all have, and I talked to the chairman when he walked into the chamber tonight, is that I think many local jurisdictions and neighborhood associations don't know that this law is on the books, and they don't know that they can find out whether or not the property is in foreclosure, and if so, who to contact to try to get the party who bid it in at the foreclosure sale to step in and take care of the property, whether it's a bank or it's, Acme Real Estate Company or Joe Dokes. So I don't think, obviously I don't think that this is the solution to the problem that you see. I think we've done a fairly good job of addressing it in Annapolis, and I think the proof is in the pudding in that the deeds do get recorded in a timely fashion. In addition, there's one other bill mentioned. In the same session, Senate Bill 123 passed, and this was a bill that local taxing authorities wanted. Once again, they want to know who owns the property too. So Senate Bill 123 required that local tax supervisors also receive a notice when a property is bid in at foreclosure. So we're trying to do everything we can to make sure that government, neighborhoods, communities know if a property is in foreclosure, and if so, who can they contact? But they have to know about the law to be able to take advantage of it. So we don't really think the bill is necessary. We'd be glad to work with any community group, with the city of Baltimore, to help educate people about this legislation. And if it needs to be tweaked somehow, we're certainly open to doing that. We have no interest in trying to keep it a secret. that the property's been bought at foreclosure. Thank you.
Well, actually, I appreciate that offer for tweaking, because one of the first tweaks that jumps to mind, listening to how the registry process is supposed to work, is that it puts a lot of the staff work onto Mr. Hessler's shop, in the sense that in my district alone, I might easily have 4 or 5 neighborhoods that are at any given time pursuing 2 or 3 houses in their neighborhood. Now, under the law as it works right now, they would have to, each neighborhood would have to individually contact Mr. Hessler's office. Someone in Mr. Hessler's office would then have to use the registry to identify all 8 to 16 properties. Then someone in Mr. Hessler's office would have to contact all of those owners themselves, which is never, we should never assume that is a one call solves the problem kind of situation. So they're making a variety of calls, trying to leave messages, get calls back while they're there and not on the phone with the other 16 people that they're trying to reach. And all of that is for me. And I have 13 colleagues who I assume on a good day have districts with at least the challenges of mine, if not more. So that's putting an awful lot of staff pressure on one little office that, frankly, was already overworked before this in terms of trying to help us resolve problems in our neighborhoods. Under the current law, they can't even give those names and addresses, or names and phone numbers or whatever. They can't even legally give that information to me so that I can have my staff do some of those follow-up calls, much less what I think many communities would appreciate: give the contact information directly to the community associations that are pursuing the problem.
With all due respect, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
I think, and once again, I'll be glad to give you a copy of was House Bill 1373 from the 2012 session. And it says specifically that
I'm sorry, is this in the same
Department may
handout that you-
authorize access to the foreclosed property registry only to local jurisdictions. That's you. Okay, and I assume that means, doesn't say just to the city housing office, it says to local jurisdictions. And it can also give that information can also be given to a person who owns property on the same block, or a homeowners association or condominium association in which the property is located. Now, if we need to tweak this language, to somehow make this registry more accessible to government officials and communities, maybe it's not clear.
Yeah.
But that was the intent. So I don't see how you or your staff aren't part of the local government jurisdiction.
Well, you got to work here sometimes to really understand how that feels.
I'd be glad, but I understand. But this is a state registry, which they got money to establish, and they set up, and your people are supposed to, just like Prince George's, are supposed to be able to access it. You want to get together and have a meeting with the state people and find out why it's not working.
I want to stress, I honestly believe that the housing department sincerely doesn't think they're allowed to give us that information by law. So yes, I would appreciate clarifying this. And if it has to be a wording change in state law, if it could just be like a letter from the Attorney General saying that they are free to give this information to me, to the community association presidents for the impacted neighborhoods. I think I speak for my committee. We would walk out of here tonight considering that a big win if that is in fact correct interpretation of existing law.
Councilman, if I may, we do share information when it's available in the registry to your office or to the other council offices or community presidents or neighbors that contact us. The issue, and I believe you're correct, is that the State Department does not consider the elected officials as government entities, and so they won't give direct access to your office, which was requested a year and a half or so ago when the registry went live. So
So it's
within
still,
Baltimore
it
City-
still does put you in a position of being kind of the
Conduit.
data chokehold.
yes, we are.
But it sounds like the intent is already there to spread this information more widely. So you'd be supportive of whatever tweak needs to be done in the law to require the state to give us that access directly? That's what I think we would be asking for.
We'd be glad to talk. I mean, I don't know what all the, I don't have any authority. I'm
Sure,
just a
yeah, no,
lawyer.
I know. Okay.
Let me just point out that in the bill, in the law, it says local jurisdiction. That's who it says can get the information. Local jurisdiction means, one, a county, or two, a municipal corporation. So maybe, that maybe it could be changed to say, a county municipal corporation, or the elected officials, duly elected officials. The concern that the legislature had when they did this, and once again, this was all done, with the city government relations staff, with the city solicitor's office at the table. The concern was also a privacy concern, to open it wide up so that everybody, to have it, there was a privacy concern to protect the privacy of the records of the people that were doing this. That was why it was limited like it is, but I don't know that we would object to elected officials getting the information if that makes it more quicker, but I'd have to run it by my client.
Councilman Mosby had the next question.
Mr. Enzer, one of the main points of your presentation surfaced around the 97.5% view that foreclosure sales were recorded within the 60 days, right?
Correct.
Right,
That was the
and-
information from the city 2 years ago.
And the justification, from the city 2 years ago. When I read through that statement from Director Black at the time, it's on the second page of his document. It says the percentage of titles that are recorded within 60 days, between 61 and 180 days after, and more than 180 days, yada, yada. According to the Division of Revenue Collections, 97.5% of all titles are recorded within 60 days of the transfer. I don't know if that's like a technical writing omission, but it doesn't necessarily say that the foreclosure sales are the 97.5% number that is the data set. Meaning, I don't know if they're saying it appears that what they're saying is 97.5% of all titles that are recorded within the 60 days. It doesn't explicitly say that out of the foreclosed sales, that 97.5% of those titles inside of that data set are recorded within the 60 days. So I'm curious, Andy, if that's a technical issue with the writing here, or if the data set was all sales in that time period that they took that from. Another curious thing is, in bullets 1 and 2, they give the time frame. They say properties transferred in this manner in 2011 in 1, and then the same thing in the second point. But the point where they bring out the statistics of 97.5% of them were transferred within those 60 days, there is no time frame mention associated with the data set.
Good point. I haven't looked at this for a couple of years. So
All right. So if you guys could go back, and I don't know who did that, and pull that to try to understand if we're trying to compare apples to oranges or if it's a true comparison throughout the board. But it's just curious that in the first 2 points, they explicitly spell it out, and then in the third point, it's very ambiguous.
Actually, Councilman, looking at the Finance Department report, it's page 2 of their report dated 5th of November 2012. Page 2 starts with the annual number of properties transferred at deed of trust or foreclosure sales.
Keep reading.
Yeah, no, in that manner in 2000. But you're right, it does not distinguish between the two at any point.
That's what I was reading from, yeah.
So
So what I'm trying to say is, Bill, is that it says 97.5% of all titles are recorded within the 60 days. That's great.
Well,
But are we talking about the data set only being tied to foreclosure sales? If we're not, I think one main point of Mr. Eaton's presentation was about Enton, I'm so sorry. Mr. Enton's presentation was around that at the end of the day, most of the banks are really following the suit of trying to record the deeds right away.
Oh, no. What I was going to ask was, I was going to ask somebody in the room who deals with big real estate, like lots of real estate transactions, how common deed of trust transactions are. Are they more common than foreclosures or less common? More common.
That's the majority of the transfers.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Deeds of trust and mortgages are the same thing, so.
Yeah, yeah.
It's, you know, if you're gonna, they're foreclosures. The deeds of trust and mortgage foreclosures are the same.
So, yeah, there's no way to be sure from looking at this
No.
that, I mean, it could be that there were only 400 foreclosure sales, but they were all the ones that took more than 60 days.
I would tell you anecdotally, talking to our members.
Yeah.
That this one came up a few years ago, and talking to the foreclosure, and there's a handful of attorneys that probably handle 80% of the foreclosures in any jurisdiction. And once again, I mean, they said that they weren't aware of anybody who was intentionally not recording deeds post-ratification. I think mostly, as I said, one of the incentives is the foreclosure attorneys typically don't get paid until the foreclosure is completed, and the foreclosure is not completed until that deed gets recorded. But I'll be glad to go back to our members and ask them, and maybe we get some more detailed information.
Yeah, it would just be interesting to look at I mean, if we already have the data, we came up with this write-up. It was just interesting to see if number 3 was specifically tied to
How much do
foreclosure
they get
sales.
paid I mean, what's an average compensation for the foreclosure attorney?
I don't know.
Okay, because I'm thinking, looking at this chart, it looks like the average recordation cost is going to be about $1,200.
I don't know. I mean, it can be a very,
It's like the number 10 and 10.
Okay, all right.
So, Andrew, you can get that?
Which would include but that would include, right? That would include the recordation tax. Okay. Councilwoman Clark.
So, to draw an analogy that probably doesn't draw well. So, in the case of foreclosure through tax sale, basically, for a while, nobody's responsible for the property because the owner who lives in it, for example, is already in tax sale and he hasn't redeemed his house. So how bad can it get? It's over. The person who's bought it doesn't have a deed because he hasn't paid up yet the bid to the city. So he owns it, but he's not responsible, at least on record. So for banks, there must be a reason there's all this attention to recording deeds and the attention of a whole committee and everything else. Like, if it's such a thing that everybody wants to do, then why have a committee? So there was a reason, or there was something falling apart that the task force you were part of addressed. And I'm not saying you didn't. I know from my own experience, which is not terribly enlightened experience with foreclosures. I mean, my idea of what to do about a foreclosure problem is to call Jason Hessler and say, gee whiz, then there's no two alike. There's no two anything alike. But there must be some kind of advantage, and from my own experience, the advantage is this, where basically there's a period of time where no one's responsible. And it's a long period of time, actually, for people that have at least given up. they're being foreclosed, there's a process that goes with it, there's nothing they can do. Now, that's for people who, that we've got a lot of places to turn these days to try to get well. But there comes a point where you can't. And then there's a bank coming to get this property. But until they record their deed, it's that never, never land of who's going to cut the grass, who's going to fix the porch that's falling on the porch next door. So what's the incentive for a bank to take its time recording itself as the owner of a property? Why did you have to have a task force to do a law to say you got to record?
We didn't have a task force to look at this one issue. There was a task force that looked at a variety of foreclosure issues, mediation. This was one issue that was addressed by the task force.
Well, I can tell you from my own experience, and it's small, it's very narrow, but that there is a period of time when nobody's taking care of, nobody's responsible. So, and that's a time when, golly day, maybe they don't do it anymore, but banks used to hire these middlemen that were expediters trying to, find a price. In other words, they were the middle people. They weren't the bank, but they were people hired by banks to come out and deal with the foreclosure and see what kind of a deal there could be. I'm just saying that there seems to be a lot of lag time between a person knowing they're being foreclosed and a bank who foreclosed them taking title and recording deed. In that time, is there any way that we could get banks to start taking responsibility at an earlier time in the process than when they actually record a deed? Is there a place in this foreclosure process that's earlier on where they could be responsible?
Let me just say that a couple things. We've had two major gubernatorial task forces to look at this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the problems that we have today is prior to the first kind of massive rewrite of the foreclosure laws, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, all the newspaper articles talked about how a person, could lose their home in foreclosure in 15 days. That really wasn't accurate. Typically, the foreclosures in those days, from the date of default probably to the date of ratification of the sale, was maybe 120 days, maybe. I mean, typically the last thing a lender wants to do is foreclose. They much rather the mortgage was kept current. So they're going to send notices to the borrower saying, you're in default. Please contact us. They're going to work with the borrower. Foreclosure is the last resort for the lender. I don't know of any surpluses in any foreclosure cases today.
What surpluses?
Where the property brings more than what's owed on the mortgage.
That's because the mortgage companies made mortgages that were beyond the value and the means. And they did it all over the United States of America. But I mean...
My point is this. My point is that now to go from default to foreclosure in the state of Maryland takes almost 2 years because of the time constraints built in by the legislature. We don't have title to the property at that point in time. It's not our property. And that property can be redeemed by the borrower right up to the date of the sale or ratification of the sale.
Okay.
So we went from maybe being here all the way over to here. We have one of the longest foreclosure timelines in the entire country now. So you're right, the property is in limbo, but we don't have title to that property.
I understand.
We loan the money. I mean, we get it both ways. We're criticized if we don't make loans, and then we're criticized when we do make the loans.
Well,
I mean,
that's,
so,
But-
I mean, right now, the real estate market is coming back. The foreclosures are going down in Baltimore City, not up. We're turning the corner on it, and maybe in a year or two, this will be a moot point. But right now, the only thing I can tell you is in the lender's best interest to see that the property is maintained, because if they're going to take title to it, and then they're going to want to hold on to it, we're not in the business of holding foreclosed properties. We don't get a penny for it. As long as we have it, we need to sell it in order to get our money.
I'm going to take this opportunity to excuse Mr. Enton from the hot seat. We have one more person who wants to testify on this bill, and to remind colleagues and anyone else in the chamber that what often happens with us when we're dealing with problems here in Baltimore City is we try to change regulations to address the bad actors in whatever we're dealing with. And whenever we are trying to get at the bad actors, we inevitably get pushback from the good actors who don't want to be inconvenienced when, in their opinion, they're not doing anything wrong now. And truthfully, in our opinion, there probably is a significant number of banks that are recording their deeds at a reasonable rate or taking care of them. The problem is there are hundreds, maybe thousands that aren't. Not banks,
don't know.
but
I don't
properties.
know. You don't have any data on
And
that.
so that leaves my colleagues and I very frustrated with a situation where the people that we're mad at aren't in the room.
Well, can I say one thing,
Well,
Mr.
actually,
Chairman? Then just let me make this last point.
I was going to say I can let you come back because I think
No, I'd like to go home and
I
have
think my
different
colleagues have additional questions if you chose to testify again. But I did want to give Mr. Duvall a chance to speak.
I'd be glad to
quickly.
meet with any one of you individually. I would be interested to know about the usage of the registry and to what degree have people reached out to the lenders that have taken title through the and who registered and have not been responsive.
Okay. Right, Mr. Duvall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, my name is Peter Duvall. I'm with the Greater Homewood Community Corporation, but I'm actually going to talk a little bit about my personal business on the side because it's more relevant, because I've just recently acquired a tax sale foreclosure property. And I want to let you know what the buyer's motivations are in different situations. I actually was in a terrible hurry to record my deed because the property was assessed at $210,000, which is worth about $50,000, and I'm paying tons of taxes, and I wanted to record the deed in order to protest my assessment. If the assessment had been $10,000, I have to say that I wouldn't have been in such a big hurry because I could have held that property, kept my cash in hand, not had my name out there, not have Mr. Hessler, trying to find me. And, the house is in perfect condition inside, so don't give me a vacancy violation. Anyway, I think that if that property had been worth a lot less and a couple other things had changed, I probably wouldn't have recorded that deed or wouldn't want it to have recorded that deed so quickly. The neighbors were after me, getting citations against the backyard, which I couldn't legally go clean up until I got the deed. So that was piling up. I could have gotten a release, but I'm not sure how that would have done after I'd actually got the judgment of foreclosure, whether they would have released those liens. So, and my neighbor, one thing that I think we all need to tell the neighbors is for the bank foreclosures, for the tax sale foreclosures, go ahead and get those citations against the property. That was a real motivator for me. I know there's a property I was dealing with up in your district where the neighbors just stopped calling in the citations so they thought it wasn't doing it good. Bank of America is not maintaining the yard. I said, well, if you got the citations against that property, and Bank of America's going to have to pay those eventually, they might care. So they promised me that they would start going out and reporting it for citations again. But Bank of America obviously, for some reason, is not maintaining this property, and they don't care, and the neighbors really aren't hurting them. So just wanted to say that, and to the question of when you pay the bid price, they take that out of your account 2 days after the sale. So my $27,000 certificate was gone. But what does pile up is the taxes in the period in between, and for that, my property, it was a lot of money because the property was so badly overassessed.
I'm sorry, you're saying you bid $27,000
Right, and they took it right out of my account.
and they took that right away.
Right. So the money that you don't pay between the judgment of foreclosure and the recording of the deed is you won't have to come up with the taxes and some of the other money and the closing expenses. That's what you don't pay. But like I said, if the taxes had been a lot lower, that really wouldn't have been such a motivator. In other people's case, it wasn't mine.
Okay.
So,
Any questions for Mr. Duvall? Councilwoman Clark?
So I'm misunderstanding what happens. I owe $2,000 on water bills and property taxes. I don't pay them.
right,
I go to tax sale. I get lots of letters starting in February,
right,
and I start calling my council representative,
right,
around March 30th.
right,
And then I go to tax sale.
right,
So let's say it's still $2,000 that I owe, but now I'm not going to pay.
right.
So my property is bid. Now, let's say so now there's a bidding war to take my property certificate, to own it. So you don't bid 2,000, you bid what you think is, well, I don't know what you do. You bid something, 27,000.
Right.
That's not, so you're saying that you bid $27,000.
27,000 was actually owed on this property in liens
So
at
you,
that time.
so, all right.
But to your point,
My point is that you then have paid off everything and you've paid your bid.
Right,
So once you have a judgment, a court gives you the right to,
right,
the ownership rights.
right. There's at least 2 years of property taxes in between because the foreclosure process takes so long.
Well, it doesn't have to, but okay. So, so you're saying that that's what you owe.
That's what you owe.
So you've already wiped out what was owed
Right,
that brought me into tax sale.
yep. That was long gone. My money is long gone.
And that was 27,000. So your bid was just what was owed. And then there's going to be more that's owed.
Right. There was another 15 grand I owed to close it, actually. So it was a lot of money.
Well, I don't want to get into a
Because,
confusing.
again, the house is assessed for such a high
So
amount.
so have you gotten your judgment? Do you
Yeah, I
own
got the
this
judgment,
place?
and I got my deed right away because I wanted to be on the property. The owner of the property is still out there and knows who I am. I don't want her to get me thrown in jail for trespassing. So I had to it's another reason I
Took
had
the
to get on.
deed.
What?
So the city gave you the deed.
Yeah, yeah. And then between the judgment of foreclosure and when I received the deed, I'm not allowed to be on the property, so I can't go clean it up.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
You have a question? Okay. All right, thank you. Seeing as that is the last person who signed up to testify on this, is there anyone else who feels a burning desire to add to the conversation? Absent that, what I think I'd like to do, given the testimony I heard tonight, is I think I'd like to continue this hearing, and not necessarily, I mean, just for practical purposes, to give us time to craft some amendments to it, clarifying some of these tweaks that we discussed to the state law to make sure that the state is willing to give access to the registry to us and to community officials to broaden the availability of the registry information. We also need to continue this hearing because we do want to take up the issue that we were not prepared to deal with tonight of the big file drawer of deeds sitting somewhere in the finance department.
Yeah.
That it sounds like we need Janice Simmons here
Ms. Simmons would be
to have that
would
conversation.
be a great person to invite.
So
She's very knowledgeable and very people-oriented, and I think that would be very helpful.
okay, so we will schedule a continuation of this hearing where we will continue the conversation on the tax sale foreclosures, as well as propose some amendments for how we would want state law to be tweaked to match its intent, while making it a little bit more user-friendly for us here in the city. Councilman, did you have questions on this?
No,
Okay, okay.
they're going to come up with the statistics too.
Oh, all right, and if the finance department could just send to the committee by email the breakdown of that chart from your original November 5th, 2012 report for foreclosures versus regular deed of trust transfers.
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, ma'am.
So can we get to see this registry? I've never seen it. I just called Mr. Hessler.
Well, that's kind of the point. Is that's
Yeah, no, I understand.
That's-
I understand that. But I probably will still call Mr. Hessler. I'd like to see whether the way the registry's set up or something,
oh, you mean just like a field trip to it?
the
To
field trip
just see
to
what
the
it looks like in-
registry. I'd like to see it, to see how practical it is. I know Mr. Hessler uses it very well, but,
It's just an Excel spreadsheet.
and it's got addresses and contact information and all that.
Has the address, and then it goes through and lists who purchased it and their address, the attorneys that were involved in the case and their address and contact information, the maintenance company if one is named, and then it's supposed to be updated when the property is transferred or a substitute purchaser or something like that's put in. So it exists, it's there, you download the whole thing based on a timeline.
I didn't want a hard copy. I just thought we could know where to go to look at the electronic copy. I mean, we're allowed to look at it, aren't we?
Sure.
I think you just have to schedule a field trip to Mr. Hessler's office, and
Yeah.
Show you.
and then he'll be happy to show you
I just want to,
all the tools of his trade.
I just want to, I hear what you're saying. I just want to see, I want to just look at it from a practical perspective.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So, so that hearing will be continued. And now we're going to move on to City Council Bill 13-293, vacant structures. I will say in advance, for the purposes for finance and for public works, that the original purpose of this bill was addressing the height to which we were requiring owners, or if not the owners, the city, to board openings when that was allowing for the issue that was raised upon introduction was allowing the elements to essentially demolish by neglect. And we had an initial hearing for this bill, which my colleagues attended, and then a work session, which several colleagues attended. And since then have continued to have conversations with the housing department. To summarize, for those of you who did not come to the initial hearing or the work session, the concern that Public Works had in a flat-out elimination of the height limit for boarding was twofold. One was an expense issue in terms of the equipment needed to safely board openings above 24 feet is more than the ladder that they can carry with them on their truck. And also the liability issue of doing that work any higher off the ground than essentially second story. The amendments that we have discussed with the housing department to date have included replacing that language with the simple words, if accessible, so that if a window that is higher is also accessible and would make that property technically open to casual entry because of something else, be it a fire escape or a tree conveniently located next to the property, or an adjacent property that itself has some type of fire escape or conveyance to higher stories, then in that case, it would be in the judgment of the code enforcement inspector to determine that that opening is considered accessible, and so it would count. But as some of you have probably heard me say more than once before, while we had the patient on the table and open and anesthetized, we decided to poke around a little bit and see what else needed to be fixed in there, and that was the point at which Mr. Hessler offered us some additional mechanisms that I think will put the bill into a slightly different category in terms of where we were initially trying to go to help the neighborhoods, but it creates a new category, a new definition of vacant nuisance properties. And I think at this point I should turn it over to Mr. Hessler to basically walk us through the proposed changes. And then, now that we're also joined by Mr. Eisenstark from Legislative Reference, we're going to try to do a little bit of wordsmithing to make sure that what housing was comfortable with and what we were trying to accomplish is also something that Mr. Eisenstark can safely put into the code in a fashion that keeps us from being sued down the line. And I know that's something that we all appreciate. So why don't we let Mr. Hessler take it away?
Okay, thank you. The amendments would expand the definition of vacant building to create a definition of a vacant nuisance property. This would be a property that is unoccupied and then also meets the criteria outlined in the amendments, which would be either that it has 2 or more property maintenance, fire, building code violations that remain unabated for 30 days or more.
Can you make copies of this?
Are there copies of these?
We're gonna make some copies right now. There are not formal copies. What we have is an interlineation that I put together so I could try to follow the conversation that we've been having online, and I think we're going to work from that, and then based on that, Avery will be in a position to actually give us amendments that we can use on second reader. I actually have it upstairs on my desk. The amendments or the interlineation? I have the other two. Okay. So do you want to? Did you want to pause, or should we?
No.
You should continue, and they'll catch up with the interlineation when
Okay.
Richard comes back.
So it creates a category or a new definition for a vacant nuisance property. So this would be a property that is unoccupied and either has 2 outstanding violations on the property that remain unabated. I believe we left it at 30 days or more. Or within a 100-day period, there have been 2 or more notices or citations to correct a property maintenance issue. So something that falls under section 305 and 306 of the Property Maintenance Code, which deals strictly with trash and grass and weeds and that sort of stuff. This gets at the heart of many of the issues that the City Council calls our office about, where in the last discussion on the last resolution, we come across properties that do not qualify currently as a vacant building. They may be unoccupied. The neighborhood may know that they're unoccupied and not being maintained by anybody. But when a housing inspector pulls up out in front, it doesn't meet the definition of unfit. A building, in order to be unfit, has to be open to casual entry, or it needs to be boarded in a way that prevents adequate light and ventilation, or there needs to be some other violation that's visible from the inspector, like he looks in the window at the second floor and he can see the sky, because there's no roof. But absent those things, the house is not going to be deemed vacant, and so it can sit there and rot from the inside out until finally enough damage has occurred to the property that it's clear that it's now unfit and we can issue a vacant building notice on it. The idea here is for those properties that are not moving through some sort of process, whether it's tax sale foreclosure, mortgage foreclosure, or any other kind of transfer, to capture those that aren't being maintained, that are being ignored and are rotting from the inside out, and be able to deal with them a lot faster before all the damage is done.
Councilwoman Clark.
Just a quick question. I've always believed that it was necessary for a house to be open to casual entry for it to be called vacant.
That's one of the criteria that would make it unfit. It could be that
No, not unfit vacant, but just vacant. Now, I mean, I'm with you if we're moving off that requirement and making it a little fuzzy around the edges.
the current definition of vacant building in the Baltimore City Code would be that it's unoccupied and unfit. And then the definition goes,
That makes it a vacant
those
house.
two things make it vacant, and the definition of what unfit means is for it to either be open to casual entry, or it could be secured in a way that prevents adequate light and ventilation. So the door is blocked with a board.
Doors where nobody is?
I'm sorry?
No light and ventilation for people indoors?
Correct. So if the idea if somebody was living in there, they wouldn't be able to easily get out of the house, or they wouldn't have enough air and light in order to operate inside the house. So
Okay.
if an owner boards up the windows and the house is perfectly fine on the inside, the tenant moves out, they
Air.
decide they want to secure the property by boarding the windows and doors, they've now created a situation where the property is unoccupied and unfit, and therefore a building inspector could come by and issue a vacant building notice.
So are we going to need to wait for that to happen before we can board a house?
We only go out and board a house if it's open to casual entry. So
Okay, so on with the show. Basically, you're creating a new class of vacants called nuisance vacant properties.
right, and these would be properties that otherwise look fine on the outside as far as the door is intact, the windows are intact.
Air's
Just
good.
Nobody's cutting the grass, nobody's picking up the newspapers. The Free Sun Plus is thrown out on the lawn and there's 14 of them. The gutters now have started to hang down. Shutters are falling off. Different things that would amount to the fact that the property is not being maintained any longer by the owner. It's no longer occupied, and now it's fallen into this situation where the city's not going to come out and cut the grass because we don't have a vacant building notice on it. The owner has run away, and there's nobody else to step in their shoes.
Oh, so then it gets to be a nuisance vacant property.
A vacant nuisance property.
And so then what happens?
Then it would fall under, like all other vacant buildings in the city, it would fall under the code, and we could do enforcement against the property similar to the current vacant buildings. So receivership becomes an option, injunctions become an option, criminal charges become an option.
Can I take something? One of the things that came out of the conversation with housing, and I know my colleagues will appreciate this, given the number of community meetings they attend. is that when you talk to most people out in the world, most people think that a vacant house is a house that nobody lives in. And it is oftentimes very confusing to have the conversation with community members that the city's definition of vacant doesn't necessarily just mean that nobody lives there. That from the city's perspective, it's very difficult for us to tell the difference between a house that has intact windows and doors and is not looking tremendously shabby on the outside, but just doesn't have anybody coming and going. It's difficult for us to, as the city, to tell the difference between a perfectly okay house where the owners have just, decided to go on vacation for 6 to 9 months because they can, and a house where the owners have left and will never ever return. And so we use the separate term of unoccupied to refer to a house that doesn't have anybody legally living in it. But then when we're faced with the fact that when you're talking to community folk, they know that's a vacant house. Like, they know what happened to the owner or occupant, and they know the occupants aren't coming back. They know that house is vacant, but the city persists in treating it as unoccupied. There are lots of houses like that scattered through the city.
Sure.
What Mr. Hessler has come up with is one more tool to try to get at some of them. So now those houses which are unoccupied, but which have, and this is where we're looking specifically at the definition, 2 or more building code, fire code, or property maintenance code violations which have remained unabated for 30 days or more. And this is where we started to get into wordsmithing issues, because we need either confirmation that the city never gives people more than 30 days to do the work, or absent that confirmation, we need some kind of little catch in there so that if the city actually gave you more than 30 days to fix something, we don't start counting the fact that you haven't done it in 30 days. Right? So that's, yeah, so that's one of the little, and Mr. Eisenstark, did you have a suggestion or, oh, I couldn't tell if you were stopping me there because you figured out, okay, no. So that's one wordsmithing note we had. Okay, is we need to resolve that. And then the second was the idea that the exterior premises of the structure, within some amount of preceding time, Mr. Hessler's initial proposal called for 100 days. I was going to suggest to the committee that we lengthen that period so that if there have been multiple problems for a house at any point in a year, in a 1 year span, that would be enough to trigger this, because I would feel bad if there was a house where there was an issue and it took a while for it to be resolved, but it got resolved, and then there was another incident 5 or 6 months later, but because it wasn't within 100 days, it didn't trigger the definition, and it continued to be something that had to be dealt with as a one-off. So I was going to propose broadening that from 100 days to 12 months. Mr. Eisenstark. Right. But Mr. Hessler was reading from his initial proposal. Mr. Hessler was reading from his initial proposal.
Correct.
When he was doing that, right? Yeah. Okay.
Proposal was to delete the 100-day period. What I received, and that's what started some of the conversation, and therefore I'm confused as to where we are. I have a draft that I distributed on the 23rd of the amendment, which created an issue because the 100 days was left out because it was deleted from an earlier draft that had the 100 days in what he gave. It's not in this handout. The 100 days doesn't appear in the handout. It perhaps should, because that will resolve a problem. It,
Well, in the interlineation.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
not
the,
in
the,
there.
the interlineation, it's already been changed from 100 days to within the preceding 12 months.
What? No. The 108. Can I try, because
Sure.
it's very difficult, I think, especially people who haven't been involved
Sure.
in the
swing.
conversations. There are two situations that the nuisance property goes at. One is an unoccupied structure for which two or more building code, fire code, or property maintenance code remains unabated for 30 days or more. And the way this is worded is after service of the violation notice, et cetera, of a violation notice. You had suggested something like, and I think that it works better because you don't want to give 30 days over 30 days where the person went,
Right.
is to make it 10 days or more after the date by which
The
the
server.
notice, order, citation required abatement. According to Mr. Hessler, and I believe that that's been confirmed. I mean, he's the source of the information, that all of the notices, all of the citations give a specified time period.
Correct.
Clean this up within 10 days, 30 days, 60 days, whatever it is.
Correct.
Depending on it. So therefore, to key it to a certain number of days, you had suggested 10, but that's open.
Let me
After the date.
Let me pause you for a second and check in. Well, the idea would be that whatever. Oh my gosh, those are new chairs. I just noticed that. The idea would be that whatever the amount of time that housing gives you to address the violation, that's already variable based on the severity of the violation. That if it's an easy fix, it's a 10-day notice. If it's a harder fix, it's a 30-day notice. And so the idea is to have a fixed time of essentially you're late if you're 10 days beyond whatever they gave you. So if they gave you 10 days and now it's 10 days goes by and another 10 days goes by, then you're 10 days late. If they gave you 30 days and 30 days goes by and another 10 days goes by, you're late. So does that work?
The amount of time is keyed presumably to the type of offense because the citation will give you so many days. If it's a total rehab, it'll give you something a little more than 30 days perhaps, if there's a real lot of problems. Is that common?
Our violation notices, so the worst violation being a vacant building would be a 30-day correction period, down to as little as 24 hours for an emergency situation like lack of heat or sanitary sewage issue.
The code doesn't require specific time. That's the reason. It just talks about promptly, which is what confuses. So it's so many days after it's supposed to be fixed. It becomes whatever that day is could be considered what I call
The
the
date of
scofflaw.
abatement.
The person who's the owner who is nowhere to be seen and nowhere to help clean up the property. If he's ignoring it and he's going it by so many days after the date specified in the notice.
So
But
then
your
so
concept.
then it would say remain unabated for 10 days or 10 days or more after
The date
the-
by which
the date by which
a violation notice, citation, or order requires abatement of the violation or requires the violation to be abated.
Okay. All right. Yes, sir.
That-
Was there ever any thought the time period in which the new status is affirmed, if it's 10 days and 10 days after, to do it proportional to the time allotted for the owner to fix the property. And I say that because I can't give any specific examples, but I'm curious to know the type of violation that you have 10 days to correct versus the type of violation that you have 30 days correct, and to provide the same amount of time frame for something that should be relatively simple, like cutting grass in 10 days versus climbing 3 stories and painting, the roof line, or it's something on a house where you have to get a scaffolding. Thank you. A scaffolding system and the like, and a permit or whatever. I don't know. Was there any indication to say maybe we should just say 2 times? So if it takes 10 days, then you get 20 days. If it takes 30 days, you get 60 days. To me, proportionally making it equal seems a better approach than to just give somebody 10 days.
I guess we had not discussed that, and I think that to do so would effectively be a second guessing of how much time they need to do it. I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing that. I mean, it would be a different conversation. It was more along the lines of when we had these conversations, the assumption was that housing was giving people adequate time to abate whatever the issue was, and that at this point, if there had been pushback from property owners or any type of organized group that the times they were giving were not sufficient to do that work, then that would have already been addressed policy-wise. So by doing a flat 10 days for no matter what the offense was, it was its own kind of fair that you're now late. 10 days is late, regardless of how much time it took for the offense, whatever the offense was. I know also there would be the issue of, I know that we have colleagues who would probably want to be able to count it as late as quickly as possible. And that may work to the advantage of the housing department and the communities in situations like that. Avery.
There's another overlapping issue, and that is that this first scenario says any 2 or more code violations or violations of, including the property maintenance code. Yet the part 2 has a whole different standard for certain parts of the property maintenance code, which will call for 100 days rather than 30, but it would already be considered a nuisance under the first part. So there's got to be an exception written into one, I believe. There's got to be an exception written into one that when we say property maintenance code, we paren other than and then refer to the 2 that are referred to in 2, number 2. I think, depending on how number 2 gets written, but and I don't, I'm working from 2 different pieces of paper that, this says 2 or more violation notice. Okay, so part 2, the exterior premises of an unoccupied structure for which at any time within the preceding 12 months, the owner, former owner, operator, person in control, agent, or other person responsible has been served with 2 or more violation notices or citations or orders. So that's not key to how many violations. And that was done purposely because I understand the discussion was that some orders, have multiple violations in them. But this is saying when you're getting to the exterior maintenance, it's suggesting a lesser standard that we're talking about, and this is based on what I was given again, 2 or more violation notices, citations, however many there might be in each, and then the problem with just that was that you could have two notices for very minor offenses. The grass is a quarter inch too tall. You know, you can have that. I just met today with someone who had an overzealous cop
An overzealous
threatening to
police
arrest
officer
threatening
here?
to arrest for an offense that doesn't exist. But there might be something like that, or a broken window that just happened. And if if there's no abatement, 100-day abatement provision, my draft doesn't have that because I never saw it in the final proposal. It was in the original that we drafted back in December. Something like it should say, I think, has been served with 2 or more violation notices, citations, orders to correct the violations of these 2 sections, 304, which is, the 2 sections dealing with exterior sanitary maintenance, and those notices, citations, and orders, which means all of the violations that are cited, those citations, notices, and orders remain unabated for X days or more after the date by which they're required to have been done. So it could be 100 days after the date by which they were required to be done. The 12 months and the 100 days are 2 different standards.
Okay.
They're not cumulative. They both come in together.
I think I can answer that, but I'm going to let Jason just to be safe.
The original intent in these 2 sections was to deal with, in the first one, violations that remain unabated over a period of time. So the thing that, the broken gutters that are just hanging there and hang there for X period of time, remaining unabated, versus in the second section, issues that are regular maintenance issues that should be maintained on a normal schedule, but aren't being dealt with on that normal schedule. So maybe somebody is coming and picking up the trash or cutting the grass on the property, but they're not doing it like everybody else in the neighborhood on a weekly basis. They're doing it every 6 or 8 weeks. So when the grass,
Or they're only doing it when they get a citation telling them that they need to be doing it.
I'm not saying it should be 100 days. That you said that in your opening, and it's not in any of the drafts that we now have.
And this is
So
and this
that's
is,
where I'm going crazy.
and I think this is the change. I think this is where this is where I think the confusion comes from. In an attempt to try to get more houses into this category so that we can use this tool more often, the interlineation melds the 2 so that now these are the 2 categories. Now there's a category where if a serious issue has gone unabated for a period of time, and technically 2 serious issues have gone unabated for a while, that is what triggers it, and there is no time limit on that. If at any point there is a second issue that is serious and has gone unabated for more than 10 days over however much time we gave to do them, that's one kind of trigger. The other kind of trigger is whenever there are multiple cases of less serious issues, but it's clear that these less serious issues are only being dealt with when we cite them, and they're not just being proactively maintained. Now, I recognize the fact that looking at it now at this point, it does seem a little unbalanced to have 2 in both cases because I think it confuses the issue. And so maybe what I would suggest is, since we've broadened it to within an entire year, say if there were 3 or more instances of less serious issues, the violation notices, citations, or orders to correct violations of the property maintenance code, If there were 3 of those incidents in one 12-month period, that would be the second trigger. And we would stick with the 2 or more of the more serious code violations that remained unabated for 10 days after whatever date the department gives them to address that. And for the record, for those at home, I want them to note that Peter Duvall is nodding and agreeing with me. So
The what?
Peter Duvall is nodding and agreeing with me, so I know that I have Greater Homewood solidly behind me.
I'm asking this because I tend to fear that I'm going to be asked to finally put together what we're deciding. I'm not sure am I correct, first of all, in assuming that we have to exclude the exterior from number 1? Or not? And it depends how you look at this. If it's 30 days or more, is that, are we treating, is that or is it 10 days after when you have to
I don't see
do
why
it?
we would have to exclude it. I mean, it would still be a viable, trigger if we called them on an exterior violation and gave them 20 days to address it, and
Okay,
30 days later it's still unaddressed. That would still be a reasonable trigger.
Okay.
Peter
I
would like
hear
to
you.
join the conversation, but you're going to need to come to something with a microphone to do that. So I'm going to say, Jason, if you want to finish this from your seat.
I was just going to suggest that you could delineate between structural issues for the more serious violations and the sanitation issues for the less serious violations, and that would be a good
Is
split.
there a clear wording description that we can use for that?
I don't-
Jason. Okay, so basically we would just leave the property maintenance code out of the first one. But I don't see anything to be gained by narrowing it that way. Because why would we not still want to address people who have problems with the?
I'm not disagreeing here. It's just to be simpler.
Okay.
And there could be made, I think, a clear distinction between exterior sanitation issues, which would be section 305 and 306,
But that's what we've already called
versus
out.
everything else.
Right, and that's what we have specified for the second trigger.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
I agree with Avery in that with the second draft, or maybe it's the third draft that came out, you do need to clarify that section so that you're not overlapping and creating a unclear situation which could then be challenged in court. So
I guess what he said made sense to me, and I'm not sucking up because sometimes I argue. Are we on TV?
We are on television.
Oh, I'm
for
sorry.
another minute.
I apologize then. If you make it like 3, if the idea is that the question is in paragraph 2, in other words, during the exterior sanitary maintenance sections, general and whatever, are they being considered the lesser important but ongoing? You know, I mean, you want to have 2 shots at them. I think Jason said it, or you said it, that, yeah, one thing is if it goes for more than 30 days, and another is you get a lot of citations, 3 citations within 12 months. I mean, you're picking up his 3. Or is it 3 violations within? In other words, right now, it's drafted the way the last draft was shown, the draft that was shown to me that I had some problems with the use of the word violations, et cetera, and other things, but it was this was drafted as 2 or more notices, citation in 2, citations or orders, not 2 or more or 3 or more violations. The thought being that, well, that's the way it was given to me, and I didn't bother changing it because I assumed the idea was these are sort of lesser. So if you get a multiple ordinance, fine, but don't get multiple citation, but don't get 2 of them or don't get 3 of them within 12 months, or otherwise you're also can be considered a nuisance premises. Either you allow it to go for more than 30 days under the first, or 10 days after, which is still an open question, I guess, or you get multiple citations within 12 months if it's, and both of those standards can apply to the same offense. And I'm backing off on what I said before, depending on the theories that are being discussed here as to why we're picking them out, why we're dividing it into 2 parts and not just one standard.
Well, let me first ask a quick protocol question, which is, are inspectors likely to note multiple violations of Property Maintenance Code sections 305 and 306 on one notice?
Initially, those items would go into citations.
Those would go into citations anyway. And so would they be 1 citation or 2 citations?
There would be multiple citations.
They'd be multiple
generally.
citations. So I think that we don't have to worry about that issue in the second trigger the way we had to worry about it in the first trigger. Okay.
Yeah, but, well,
I'm willing to settle for grudging acceptance from both.
you know, at this point, it's a policy question, I think, most of this. The suggestion about structural versus non-structural, I don't think the code is that clearly, you can use those words without going into
what
the
Richard
structure.
pointed out is that if we wanted to do structural versus non-structural, we could
So,
just do the building code and leave the property maintenance code.
So
out.
if-
but I don't
if-
think I want to do that.
If
You would-
you're saying, I get 3, let's say 3, with 3 3 citations within 12 months, even if I immediately, when I get the violation, I've already violated. I'd let it go longer than it should. But if it's minor, even if I immediately clean it up, just within 24 hours or within 12 hours, I've complied with the citation. Well, it also will require me to pay something, but that's a different standard. That will count towards being a nuisance property if I receive so many of those within 12 months, whatever the number is.
Correct.
Then there is no problem with deleting the 100-day or any other day unabated period.
Well, no, because in this interlineation, we've already eliminated the 100-day.
Well, yeah, again, I'm
Right.
going back to a
Here's
different version. The
So-
version I saw did not have it. The question I had, which is now being answered, is that what you want? That even if it's paid immediately, and then it's a question 2, is 2 within 12 months something that makes it a nuisance? The grass grows too long in twice in 12 months. Maybe 3 makes it a little more showing that the guy's a scofflaw. But I was going by Jason's opening statement that it was going to be subject to a 100-day non-abatement.
So this is where I think we are right now. Okay. If we leave out Jason's opening statement, which referred to the original proposal, and we just look at the interlineation before us, we've made one change to 116.4.1.3, nuisance property means. We've made one change to section 1, the first trigger,
Making it so many days.
which is instead of saying 30 days, it's going to say 10 days. And instead of saying after service of a violation notice, It's going to say
After the date by which the violation notice requires.
date by which the violation notice requires that
Right.
it be abated. So that's one change. And then in that same section, but the second paragraph, the second trigger, so as to avoid a little bit of confusion and to address more fairly the fact that it's the span of a year, we're going to change the 2 or more violation notices to 3. But have that still be a year-long span for which that trigger would be effective. So basically, that trigger becomes a 3 strikes and you're out rule.
The owner is not paying attention.
The owner's not paying attention clearly. So given that, I think we're comfortable with the idea that that's how the amendments for second reader should be drafted for us to vote on at a voting session where we have quorum, because we no longer have quorum tonight. And I see both Mr. Enton and Mr. Duvall straining at the bar. Oh, and Mr. Klein. So I'm going to say Mr. Klein, having already been seated in front of the bar, gets to speak first, then Mr. Enton, then Mr. Duvall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one modification I would ask for in the amendments, and this is under required safeguarding.
No, I was hoping you were going to ask if they pay in cash. But go on. Okay.
Number 2, I would suggest that read if readily accessible. I mean, accessible could be, without qualifying that, I think it's
I'm
too
comfortable
wide
leaving
open.
accessible to the judgment of the code enforcement officials. Readily,
Here. Because readily accessible is the current language, and I think it should be left that way, because it won't just be the judgment of the code enforcement folks. Anyone could challenge this and say, hey, I consider that accessible,
but if we, well, by that logic,
even if it's up on the 3rd floor.
By that logic, anybody could challenge readily accessible.
But readily accessible is more descriptive.
But it also won't previously, it won't still exist in the law when we take out the bracketed section before it. So it's not like we're trying to be consistent. We're not being, there's nothing, is readily accessible used elsewhere in the code as a term of art? Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So I mean, if it's all the same, I would prefer to err on the side of accessible, because, as you know, I would like to see the opportunity there for us to require boarding in more openings, not fewer.
Aha.
So as
That's exactly why I'm asking you to change it.
But I'm leaving it at this point up to the judgment of the housing department to decide whether or not that opening needs to be boarded. I'm not requiring it as the initial bill would have. I'm going to trust in the housing department's judgment that if an opening needs to be boarded, it will be. And I would prefer not to constrain them any tighter than if accessible.
But I think readily accessible meets the definition that you stated earlier in the hearing about what kinds of openings, that, there might be a fire escape or a tree that makes it, and you use the word casual entry, which is not in that part of the
I looked over to see
law.
if I could get any wisdom from the rest of my committee, but since it appears that the rest of my committee is no longer here to offer that wisdom, I'm going to say we're going to leave it like this for now. And by now, I literally mean the remaining 2 or 3 minutes of the hearing. And I promise to provide you with additional opportunity to give a compelling case for making it readily as opposed to just accessible between now and when we have the voting session on the amendments.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Enton.
We took a look at the original bill, and have not had a chance to really focus on the amendments. We had no position on the bill as introduced. I do, because we do end up with vacant, we have liens on properties, mortgages on properties, they can become vacant. If I understood, and I didn't have anything in front of me to look at, but if I understood the discussion,
There were no more interlineated. I'm sorry, I thought I asked for enough. I
Yeah,
didn't.
I think you ran out of copies, giving them to people in front. If I understood the discussion, I guess what concerned me just listening to it is if I got 3 citations within a 12-month period, does that mean that I've been adjudicated to be in violation? Or let's say I have an inspector who's got it in for me, and he issues me 3 citations. It turns out that none of them were justified, that the property wasn't in wasn't in the condition as alleged, but now I've kind of fallen into this, met the definition, and have my property can be turned over to a receiver. You talk about legal challenges. That would seem to me to violate due process. It'd be like getting 3 speeding tickets within a 12-month period, but never having been found guilty on any of the speeding tickets.
You have the opportunity to fight any violation notice or citation on merit, and
But I guess what is it that triggers? What is it that triggers me falling into this category where now I got the ability, I could lose my property? Is it just the issuance of the citation or the finding of guilt under the citation?
In the first, can I
Sure.
try to, in the first paragraph, the one that is general, not just exterior property, it says, if it remains unabated so many days after, if you ultimately appeal it, and it gets washed out, it's been abated.
Right.
And therefore, I don't think it would count. The timing, you might not be able to do it within 10 days after the time you're supposed to have done it.
For a period of time to me.
Yeah. Well,
10
no,
days
it's
after
10 days
however much
after
time
the period
you had
given
to abate
to
it.
abate. So it's 10 days more than the notice, or whatever the time is. But the second paragraph, that is a problem, because it doesn't refer to any period of unabatement, of non-abatement, and your problem theoretically
Well,
could apply to the issuance.
let me say this: if you're talking about a property where you're asserting the hypothetical possibility that an inspector would write a fraudulent citation citing you for property maintenance issues that don't really exist and requiring that they be abated, I would assume that any property owner in receipt of an inaccurate citation is going to go back to the city and say, hey, what is this talking about? There's nothing wrong with my property. Here, I just took a picture of it. This is what my property looks like. What are you doing here? At which point, there are various, I guess there'd be different processes for the different kinds of notices. I'm most familiar with the Environmental Control Board citations, where the Environmental Control Board is authorized to invalidate any citation which was improperly issued. And if they did so, then you would no longer have been served with it because it wouldn't exist anymore.
Once again, I haven't had a chance to spend much time. I'd be glad to talk to the folks from the department, but and I'm no expert on how all this stuff works. Believe me, I deal with mostly the stuff at the state level. But just sitting here as a lawyer listening to it, I'm a Baltimore City resident. So I own property in Baltimore City. It may not be, maybe it's not fraudulent. It's just a disagreement as to whether or not, what the condition of your property constitutes a violation or not. It seems to me that you can't trigger the taking of the property just upon the issuance of a citation.
We're not taking them.
The issuance of the citations, this would then trigger the issuance of a new violation notice, a vacant building notice, that would then start a whole new appeal process and a whole new set of due process before you would even get to any kind of enforcement. So it doesn't jump from a citation to the loss of a property. It goes to declaring the building vacant as a vacant building nuisance, and then a notice being issued with the ability to have an administrative hearing and if the department or the city decides to move forward, then a court case.
Not unlike my comments with the previous piece of legislation. The concerns you're raising are those of an active, engaged, responsible property owner, which would be unlikely to be one who would fall into this particular net. Because if you're active and you're engaged, then you don't need the city to tell you to mow the grass on your property by receiving a high grass and weeds citation. You don't need the city to tell you, hey, go take a look at your property and clean up the trash that's being dumped in it by getting an unsightly, yard citation. If you're being a good proactive, property owner, if you've got a good property manager, then these are not going to be your issues.
Yeah, I just have to.
Yeah,
I'll be
sure.
glad to. I'll be glad to have a discussion
What
about
I'm
it.
asking
But
is,
I just think
Maggie, if you would please make sure that
The
Mr.
problem
Enton
is
is on
whether
the
you
list
can-
of people who get
problem is
the
whether you
amendments
can trust the
circulated
bureaucrats
when
to do
they're
these
drafted.
That's
Bob, I'm going to make sure that we get you a copy of the formal amendments
right,
when
have a
they're
chance to
when they're
talk about them
drafted.
before they're acted on. And,
well, if
I just need to understand the process. You can't have a trust me situation here. The law says you can do X upon Y, then that's what the law says.
I wouldn't worry at all if one could trust the bureaucracy to be reasonable. In other words, if the three or more, it's served on him, but he goes to let's not pick on to the board, the citation. The board takes forever and finally says, you're right, this was issued to the wrong property, but it stays on, it doesn't get removed from the paperwork, or they say, we're going to still count it because you were served with it and you didn't do anything. Let's say the guy paid the citation, he didn't want to bother with it.
In that scenario, I'm still confident that Bob is a good enough lawyer to point out that as soon as the board said that we're going to wipe the citation out, even if somebody did not do the right data entry thing, you're going to have that to deal with, in terms of fixing it down the line. Am I going to promise that everything will flow smoothly and completely 100% of the time? That'd be nice. But I think right now what we're looking at is we're looking at a tool that I think is going to help Mr. Hessler's shop help people who are dealing with bad actors. And I think that there's a general commitment across the board to try to prevent good actors from slipping into that, and when they do, try to help them out, but not at the expense of missing the bad actors. So I'm going to say that this. Oh, I'm sorry, Peter. I did. That's right.
Pretty quick. I really endorse this bill. The house that I got through tax sale foreclosure should have been a vacant house 10 years ago. It's ridiculous that things hang on. I know there's a house in the neighborhood that every window is broken out, and I complained for 5 years in a row. This should be a vacant property. Took 5 years to get a vacancy violation. Houses that are boarded all the way up to the fire escape window, so no one could get out if they live there. Can't get a vacancy violation. It's, this may be a very strict standard, but the standard for vacancy violations currently is just way too loose. My main question is just legislative intent. Is this going to apply to commercial properties, which are also a huge problem? You keep talking about houses.
I do keep talking about houses. I'm trying to think if there is anywhere in it that prohibits it from applying to commercial property. I don't see that prohibition.
It's also very hard to get vacancy violations against commercial properties because they don't have the heat,
Jason,
light, and air.
is there anything
requirement.
in here that you think would keep it from being used for commercial?
No, the property maintenance code applies to
Yeah.
to both. So
Okay, just wanted to make sure, because that'll be helpful also.
Okay. It is my intention to conclude this hearing because I think at this point we've had most of the conversation we need to have on it. I understand you're going to want to try to reach out to Jason before we do a voting session on the amendments, and I'm happy to try to be part of that conversation if you think it would be an assistance. Otherwise, I think that we're going to send all this back to legislative reference.
I'll get you a redraft tomorrow.
And we'll get a redraft, and then at that point, I think it's incumbent upon me to have some individual conversations with my committee to make sure that everybody is up to speed on what we have finally concluded here in public conversation. That being said, thank you all for attending this hearing. Please check the area around your seat to make certain you have everything that you brought with you. We will be closing the room shortly and ask that everyone exit promptly to the first floor main entrance unless they actually work here in City Hall. Once more, thank you for visiting City Hall. This hearing is concluded.